I write this as one small man with a slow pen beneath a cold lamp, because there are some things best told by someone who remembers the shape of silence. I am Gas Havelock, a chronicler of deeds and deaths, and I was asked, insisted upon, in truth, to set down the beginning of a tale that has become something like a rhyme repeated in the mouths of survivors and the hollow machines that now walk where they once bled. I make no claim to the impartiality of stone or of servo-iron. I have my affections and my scars. Yet I will try, in the stead of memory and with the blunt instruments of language, to make the iron hands legible to any who would know them, their forging, their creed, and the man who bound them together, Ferrus Manus. Medusa is a world that does not forgive softness. It is a planet of black rock and thin, bitter air, where the ground opens in places to vomit heat and where the sky is often a bruised gray that tastes of metal. Rivers run like molten ore in some regions, in others the soil is brittle with mineral salts that crack the soles of boots and the conscience of men. The weather there is not weather so much as a correction, a constant lesson that the body is a flawed instrument, subject to rust, erosion, and the fickle mercy of the elements. To be born upon Medusa is to learn very early that the universe does not pause for pain. From such a harsh cradle the iron hands came not by chance but by conviction. Their origins are braided with the planet's design, forges hewn into living bone of mountain, tribes who traded sinew for steel and who believed, with a clarity born of necessity, that improvement was not sacrilege but survival. If one's hand was crushed by rock or eaten by fungus, one did not languish in lamentation, one harvested the metal beneath one's feet and learned to make the wound into a tool. Where others saw mutilation and loss, the people of Medusa saw potential. This is the doctrine, the seed, from which the iron hands grew. Flesh is weak, weakness must be excised. Iron, when grafted upon the living, is not merely substitution but transcendence. They were not ascetics running from the body, they were engineers of the self. Augmentation was worship. Where other legions might sanctify the sword or the banner, the iron hands sanctified the joint, the elbow reinforced, the eye replaced by optic arrays, the heart shrouded in alloy. They did this for honor and for victory, because pain and frailty were not tragedies to be mourned indefinitely but variables to be corrected. Ferrus Manus, primarch, leader, hammer of his men, was the living embodiment of that creed. He stood upon the platform of his fortress as if he were an anvil come to life, broad-shouldered, precise, eyes pale and steady as a craftsman who has long since learned the temper of metal and the stubbornness of truth. He did not shout to inspire. He did not need to. Ferrus's voice was a measured instrument, uttered as if from within a foundry, exact, unromantic, and utterly persuasive to those who understood the language of effort. I have seen men bend to his will and call it mercy. I have seen boys sharpen themselves against his gaze and come away with hands steadier and faces harder. Ferrus was not warm in the way that pleases folk, his warmth was the steady heat of a forge that softens raw ore into the shape of purpose. He was proud without vanity, he took a private pleasure in design and in the craft of war. He believed in action more than in prophecy, in the straight line from problem to solution, and in the moral clarity of things that could be fixed. This clarity was the magnetic center of the iron hands. Under his command the legion came to think of themselves as an engineering project whose subject was the human soul. Yet there was tenderness in him, not the sentimental kind that is sung of in taverns, but the rare tenderness of a surgeon who cleaves away the gangrene to save the patient. He loved his legion with the exactness of a man who loves a machine, by knowing its parts, by understanding its failures, and by keeping every joint oiled. There was no spectacle of brotherhood in his ways, his affection was shown in discipline, in the careful distribution of arc welders and in the insistence that each augment be fitted without hurry and without superstition. To be favored by Ferrus was to be chosen for repair, to be punished by him was to be given a second chance through steel. It is important to note that Ferrus's convictions did not arise in a vacuum. He was, as all primarchs were, both found and forged. The earliest memories that age in his mind like cindered ash are those of a child who learned callous truths, the cry of collapsing stone, the bitterness of inadequate shelter, the sudden, bright pain of losing fingers to misfortune. In those youth-etched moments he made oaths to himself, silent promises that no wound would be allowed to cripple a man's destiny longer than necessary. Where others might have been broken and then rebuilt into brittle icons of resentment, Ferris became a craftsman of restoration. He dedicated himself to the hard art of making men whole again. This, he believed, was not merely survival but moral obligation. There is a story, told by ironmongers and old Medusan midwives, that Ferris once lost his own hand in a gorge collapse. It is told not to make a myth but to show method. Out of necessity he fitted a crude prosthesis, fashioned from the wreckage itself. The earliest augmentations were not the elegant servos and monofilaments later described in manuals and records. They were rough, practical, and ugly in the way of things that work and are not ornamental. He learned there to measure the tolerance of flesh under load and to temper metal to match the grace of bone. The drama of it, if there was any, was always rhetorical. Ferris would speak of those early years with the cool affection of a master who recalls his first apprenticeship. Into this ordered life stride Fulgrim, bright, brilliant, and the mirror that would later reveal so many flaws. Fulgrim's early glory was not the rusted, functional kind, it glimmered. He arrived on the stage with a flair for artistry, an aesthetic of war that made banners bloom and tactics sing. Where Ferris saw a broken limb and thought of bolts, Fulgrim saw a broken man and thought of poetry. He was not less devoted to honor, indeed, his sense of honor was expansive, but he cherished the elegance of action, the perfection of a blade's arc, and the adulation that comes when beauty and slaughter dance in step. The two men, then, were like two methods of smithing, Ferris the heat and the hammer, Fulgrim the final polish that makes a sword lie rightly in a back. Their friendship was not immediate celebrity nor was it the gossip thing of tavern songs. It was built slowly, in campaigns where the cold breath of death could not be ignored and in late-night councils where designs were argued over maps on tables lit by guttering lamps. Ferris admired Fulgrim's artistry and the way men followed him because he promised a kind of immortality, glory preserved in verse and monument. Fulgrim admired Ferris's sure hand and the way commands were executed because they were not rhetorical promises but the outcome of meticulous planning and honest labor. Brotherhood between them grew from mutual utility into affection, and from affection into a bond made concrete by shared campaigns. They were brothers not because the fates declared it but because each had given the other something essential. Ferris gave structure, Fulgrim gave purpose. There was a cadence to their camaraderie. Ferris would polish tactics, Fulgrim would arrange the pageantry. Ferris would set the schedule for augmentation clinics across the Legion, Fulgrim would deliver the orations that made those clinics feel like sacraments. In quieter nights, when the Legion rested within the ringed metal of a temporary fortress, I have been told, by half-sober captains and by scribes who liked to imagine themselves wise, that Ferris and Fulgrim would sit in companionable silence, sometimes arguing over a problem of mechanism, sometimes discussing a poem or a painting. In these moments the men were human in ways their enemies could never imagine. They laughed over the absurdities of command, fretted over men lost to needless errors, and schemed about how to refine the iron hands into a perfect instrument of war. The Legion itself took shape under Ferris's pragmatic temper. It was not a body organized for swagger, its ranks were an explicit commitment to function. The Iron Hands prioritized engineering platoons, field forges, and augmentation regiments. They set up clinics at the back of the line where wounded brothers could be drawn out of the mud and given new joints and new sight. There were rituals, yes, but they were rituals of craft. The brazing of a joint was performed with the same solemnity as a prayer in other temples. Scribes wrote hymns, strange, metal-laced psalms, to torque and tolerance. The Legion's banners carried sigils not of blood but of cog and hand, a likeness of the human palm overlaid with gearwork, an emblem that declared both the lineage of man and the future of his improvement. From the outside, this looked like coldness. Their enemies would later caricature the Iron Hands as things halfway between men and machines, stripped of heart and softened feeling. But those who served knew the truth in different shades. To the Iron Hands, the replacement of flesh with alloy was not a denial of feeling but an augmentation of fidelity, fidelity to duty, to brotherhood, and to the idea that no man should be allowed to fail his fellows because of biological frailty. It is a difficult nuance for poets. It is the kind of nuance better understood by those who have watched a sergeant fall in battle and then seen him rise again, iron arm catching the standard so that the formation did not break. A man's soul, Ferris believed, could be tempered, it could be hardened without losing its capacity to choose. This belief had its rituals. There were ceremonies in which veterans who had lost limb or eye would present themselves before their brothers and accept the metal that would take their place. Each augmentation was accompanied by measured vows, not of piety but of purpose, to bear the new weight without flinching, to let the graft be a promise to fight smarter, truer. Men of the Iron Hands learned to speak of their prostheses in terms that others would reserve for oaths and titles. They spoke of torque and yield, of cycles and maintenance, and in doing so they rendered the cataclysm of war into calculable variables. In the language of engineers, the human heart was something to be protected by structure, not replaced by whim. It is important to note the humility that Ferris required. He did not demand that men abandon emotion. He demanded that emotion be channeled into a disciplined will. If a brother mourned, the mourning would not be allowed to fester into paralytic grief that endangered the whole. The Iron Hands learned to measure sorrow as they measured stress, to recognize its load and to engineer ways to distribute it. This is why they remained so terrifying in battle. What seemed like coldness was, in truth, a system that converted grief into resolve. But no system is immune to the human heart. Even as Ferris tightened bolts and set tolerances, other things were changing in the wider galaxy. New philosophies whispered like wind across the faces of his officers. The Emperor's grand designs reached into the void, drawing all manner of men toward different dreams of perfection. For now, though, in this first chapter, the Legion was at its apex, unyielding and united, a collection of men who had become better than themselves through steel, led by a man whose hands had learned to write both law and manifesto upon their own flesh. Fulgrim's early deeds were laureled across banners and carved into the annals of the Legion. He had the gift of presence, an ability to make cruelty look exquisite and duty look like devotion. The men admired him, the artisans of Medusa envied his gifts with ornament and with rhetoric. He and Ferris together formed a balance, one hammered, the other polished. Both believed in excellence, if in different measures. Yet even in the first days, I sensed small waverings under the surface. Brotherhood can bear strain if both parties accept the burden. It begins to fray if desire takes the form of an uncompromising pursuit. Ferris prized correction and the shared acceptance of toil. Fulgrim, whose glory loved an audience, began to cherish the idea of perfection for its own display. Not yet a tragedy, no, not in this chapter. Still, like a hairline crack in a forged blade, a minute fissure appeared. The two men noticed different truths in the same facts. Where Ferris saw a limb to mend, Fulgrim saw an opportunity to make beauty. Where Ferris sought to make men whole, Fulgrim dreamed sometimes, perhaps, of an art that would leave no scars at all. So the Iron Hands stood then, disciplined, brutal, and committed to the law of improvement. Ferris Manus, hammer, mind, and worsted heart, remained at their center, a figure of measured authority whose love was shown in maintenance schedules and corrective doctrine. Fulgrim, brilliant and gilded, shone beside him, and in their mirror each saw the other's strengths. The world beyond Medusa was swelling with conflicts and fantasies. In their forges, men were learning the mechanics of survival. I end this chapter the way instruments cool after forging, with a hush. The Legion slept in the ringed barracks, their augmentations warming with the residue of the day's work. In the quiet, a few men walked the sentry paths, feeling the slight give of metal against tendon as if to remind themselves they were still alive. Ferris, I am told, went to his private forge and stared into the heart of his creation. He spoke seldom, but when he did, his words were like chisels, unadorned and deep. He believed, with a stubbornness that could be fatal, that weakness could be excised without losing the soul beneath. If that belief was to be tested, and tested it would be by no single campaign or blade. It would be the slow, corrosive pressure of choices, of envy, and of the question that every human, alloyed or pure, refuses to answer without consequence: how much of ourselves must be given up in the pursuit of perfection? I write again with the slow, apologetic hand of a man who remembers more than he wishes to. If the first chapter was the laying of rails and the forging of iron, this chapter is the hairline crack that runs unseen beneath lacquer and oath. It begins, as all betrayals do, with small things, the tilt of a head, an unfinished sentence, an order given with a smile that does not reach the eyes. I am Gas Havelock. I observed from the margins. I will try to make clear how the seeds of doubt took root between Ferrus Manus and Fulgrim, and how a bond that had the solidity of tempered steel began to fray under heat neither man believed would test them. The campaigns that followed the early consolidation of the Iron Hands were many and varied. Some were straightforward sieges in which logistics mattered more than rhetoric, others were dances of calculation, probing for weaknesses in opponent lines. In them the legion earned its name. It was methodic, relentless, and efficient. Ferrus ruled these operations with the mind of an engineer. He balanced risk, calculated tolerances, and refused sentimental gambits that would cost lives without objective gain. Fulgrim, in those same years, was his equal in courage and his opposite in temperament. Where Ferrus measured, Fulgrim elevated. He believed that a victory should not only be won but engraved upon memory. His actions were frequently designed to leave an imprint, victory as monument rather than mere survival. At first the differences were complementary. Fulgrim's flourish after a successful phase of a campaign made soldiers feel they had not merely survived but had become part of something larger. Ferrus's steady planning meant fewer lives were thrown away in improvisation. But slowly, with a softness almost like erosion, the balance changed. The legion's officers began to whisper, small comments that found their way into mess halls and into the private logbooks of captains. Fulgrim's victories were becoming more ornate, his orders favored spectacle. He started to prefer maneuvers that could be told in songs rather than in tables of supply and outcome. He favored the sword's arc and the banner's positioning over the hard, unromantic calculus of attrition. It began with little luxuries, an extra company kept as a reserve purely for pageantry, a late-night parade after a siege had already been secured. Soldiers, who had once been happy simply to be alive and wired into a schedule of maintenance and rest, found themselves expecting more than mere survival. Fulgrim's presence turned engagements into theater. The men admired him for it, they wanted the story, and in wanting it they began to prefer the storyteller to the smith. Ferrus noticed these changes the way a chief engineer notices the fatigue line in an otherwise well-tempered girder, first as a faint anomaly, then as a cause for inspection. At first he catalogued them in his mind, anomalies to be corrected, a style to be realigned to purpose. He trusted that Fulgrim, once reminded, would temper his taste for pageantry with the sober necessities of command. Ferrus was not naive, he believed faith in the soundness of purpose was a thing to be taught, and that a brother who had stood at his side through so many councils and forges would not willingly abandon the hard truths that had shaped them. Fulgrim, however, began to speak differently in private councils. Where he once deferred to logistics, now his language turned to perfection. He would describe a maneuver not in terms of expected losses and gain in ground but in terms of its elegy. Make them remember us, he would say, fingers tracing the air as if polishing an invisible blade. Make them speak of the shape of our attack after the bodies have cooled. These phrases, artful and stirring, did not sit well with Ferrus. He heard in them an elevation of form over function, and he began to suspect that Fulgrim's definition of victory was widening into something that accommodated vanity. The first campaign in which the tension was obvious was the taking of Tarn's Keel, a planet whose name men pronounced in battle lore as if it were a talisman. The situation required a steady, methodic approach, secure the supply nodes, hold the choke points, avoid encirclement. Ferrus charted the operation with the careful, arithmetic precision he was known for. It was a campaign designed to win with minimal attrition. Fulgrim, given command of a prizing flank, chose instead to attempt a decisive charge that would break the enemy's command nodes in such a dramatic way that their collapse would appear theatrical from orbit. The plan was audacious, elegant in the way that the blade of a dancer might be, but unnecessary. It was a risk that promised spectacle. When the maneuver was executed, it at first seemed glorious. Fulgrim led the charge himself, radiant and appearing above the field as if summoned, and for an hour his flank tore a jagged memory into the enemy lines. Men who survived told how Fulgrim's presence seemed to reorder fear. But the success came with a cost. His chosen flank had been stripped of reserves because the assault used up much of the legion's reserve that Ferris had allocated to later reinforcement. Unforeseen counterattacks found the rest of the formation thin. The enemy exploited this weakness, and what had been a dramatic coup turned into a prolonged slaughter where more men died than logistic models had predicted. Ferris, watching the damage reports, felt a cold prick of betrayal. He spoke to Fulgrim afterwards beneath the makeshift canopy of the field hospital, amid the hissing of steam and the dark metallic tang of blood and solvent. Ferris did not shout. He never did. He took the Primarch's hand. His touch might have been mistaken for tenderness, but it was the hand of a man checking welds, and he said, quietly, "You cost us men who might have been kept whole." Fulgrim's response was a smile that did not reach his eyes. "They do not ask to be kept whole, Ferris," he said. "They ask to be given a story that will outlast them." "You make them die for your poetry," Ferris replied. "We are not poets. We are soldiers." "You would have us merely machines," Fulgrim whispered back. "You would strip us of everything that makes our victories worth knowing." The exchange was small to outsiders. It was, in the moment, just heated words between two commanders. To men who had followed them for years, it was a signpost. It made officers shift uneasily in their armor when they thought no one watched. Ferris walked away that night with more than a bruise to his pride. He carried the image of bright, garnished banners floating above bodies that could have been saved. He catalogued it into his drawer of grievances and made a mental note to quantify it, as if by transforming it into a metric he could solve it. The seeds of doubt take root fastest where certainty has been a creed. Ferris, who had always believed that pain could be engineered away, began to realize that there were kinds of pain that metal could not correct: shared grief, moral injury, the slow corrosion of trust. Each ornate victory of Fulgrim seemed to be a small siphon on the Legion's structural integrity, for it asked for risk in the name of beauty. The men looked to Fulgrim for affirmation of their valor and to Ferris for assurances of their survival. They wanted both, and nothing in human nature allows two masters of different truths to rule the same heart without conflict. Fulgrim's tastes grew ever more conspicuous. He began to redesign regalia on the field, insisting that banners should be reworked into forms that told myths rather than marched protocols. He refused to sign off on augmentations unless they were made to be not only functional but beautiful, an edict that frustrated the practical smiths of the Legion. He started hosting salons for artists and rhetoricians in the quieter hours, inviting lauded carvers from colony worlds to fashion medallions that glittered in the sunlight, and in doing so he introduced new voices into the Legion's periphery, men and women who cherished ornament and who began, subtly and inevitably, to shape opinion where strategy used to dominate. Ferris found this unsettling. He had never denied the good that craftsmanship could do, indeed, he revered it. But he had learned his reverence at the forge line, where design followed need. To him, beauty that required spare men to produce was in poor taste. He saw Fulgrim's predilections as a misallocation of resources, an indulgence that could, if allowed to breed, seemingly justify sacrifices of lives on an altar of aesthetics. He was not blind, he could appreciate the morale that came from beauty. Yet his mind was a machine of metrics. He could not reconcile the emotional surge that art produced with the hard numbers of attrition. The emotional distance between them widened not in a single rupture but in the accumulation of decisions. Ferris began to measure Fulgrim's rhetoric against outcomes and found, again and again, anomalies. Where Ferris expected an equilibrium of lives saved versus ground gained, Fulgrim would tilt toward grander gestures that yielded stories. To some captains this was desirable, to others it was reckless. When Ferris raised objections, Fulgrim dismissed them as the narrow concerns of a man who feared greatness. There were personal signs too. Ferris noticed that Fulgrim had begun to travel with a different retinue, one that included aesthetes and artisans whose praise for him was intoxicating. These men were not bad by nature, they were gifted, impatient, and prone to the same hubris that great artists bear. They flattered Fulgrim and gave him the language to ascribe sacredness to his decisions. Ferris, who had always valued honest praise for the work of a soldier, observed the change with a slow unease. It came to a point where Ferris could no longer catalogue these things as mere eccentricities. He saw the pattern. Fulgrim's choices were increasingly self-centered in the tactical sense, aimed at creating moments that would be remembered rather than at avoiding needless suffering. The younger officers, those who had grown up on songs about Fulgrim, began to mirror his words, and departure from Ferris's austere strictures was increasingly clothed in the language of art. "This action will be glorious," they would say. "It will polish the name of our legion." Glorious, Ferris thought darkly, was becoming code for risky. A confrontation was inevitable. It arrived not on a battlefield but in Ferris's private study, where the Primarch had spread route charts and supply manifests under the dim light of a lamp that smelled of oil and metal. The war that day was quiet, the line held, and so Ferris had a rare moment to call Fulgrim to account without the distractions of immediate carnage. "Why do you value the visible more than the survivable?" Ferris asked, eyes on the schematics as if the answers might be hidden in the ink. Fulgrim came in with the easy grace of one who loved being seen. He ran his fingers along the edge of a map and said, "Because men will forget a line on a page but remember a moment in which they felt they were more than their injuries." "You make them more than their injuries and then ask them to be less than they are," Ferris shot back. "You ask them to throw themselves into memory." Fulgrim's face hardened. "You would have us be merely useful, Ferris. You would have us be cogs. Is that your proudest vision of the Iron Hands? A legion without beauty?" "My proudest vision is a legion made of men who return home," Ferris said. "You risk what we have built for the sake of echoes." "Echoes feed the soul," Fulgrim replied, slow and certain. "You cannot live on iron alone." It was the first time Fulgrim had used the word soul in a way that implied deficiency in Ferris's approach. Ferris felt something like outrage and something like pity at this. He had always believed that while machinery could fortify flesh, the soul, if it existed, could be preserved by honor. But Fulgrim's argument struck at a place Ferris rarely acknowledged, the human craving for meaning that transcended survival. Ferris, for all his engineering, had never fully furnished answers to the poetry of dying or the theater of victory. The conversation ended without concession. They left the study like two men who had changed the terms of their common language. Officers who overheard scraps of their exchange returned to their duties uncertain which of the two would be the moral lodestar in the campaigns to come. The seeds of doubt, once planted, had taken the faintest root into the soil of mutual expectation. Over the following months their differences made themselves felt in small policy choices that aggregated into strategic divergence. Where Ferris tightened standards of augmentation to ensure consistent quality, Fulgrim insisted upon bespoke enhancements that were as ornamental as functional. Ferris viewed this as introducing unnecessary failure points into the system. Fulgrim described it as an elevation of purpose. Men began to pick their loyalties in private ways, sometimes inconsequential, sometimes not. A captain who preferred polished beauty might get a promotion in Fulgrim's retinue, one who valued efficiency might find favor with Ferris. The split was not clean, but it was perceptible, like two lines running close together until geometry demands they separate. In quiet nights Ferris found himself replaying conversations he had had with Fulgrim since their youth, searching for where the divergence had first taken form. He remembered, as we all remember the scent of the first furnace of our youth, the moment when Fulgrim had once stood at his side and said, "We will make our names sing for centuries." At the time Ferris had not believed that words could be as dangerous as blades. He had been wrong. Doubt is a corrosive, patient thing. It seeps into decisions and widens the gap between intention and action. For Ferris it manifested as sleepless nights spent poring over manifests and casualty reports, searching for patterns that would absolve him or indict his brother. For Fulgrim it acted like a validation of his own aesthetic, every cheer for his theatrics was grist for his confidence. Between them, the chorus of the legion began to hear two refrains. Men who had once spoken a single tongue now found themselves translating between an engineer's grammar and an artist's syntax. The chapter of Seeds of Doubt ends not with betrayal but with a new configuration of loyalties and philosophies. No blade has yet fallen between them, but the hum of different electric hearts can be felt in the echoing corridors of their citadel. I write this to mark the slow coming of a change that would not be contained with speeches or censures. There is, in all history, a quiet before a tempest, an interval in which the air tastes different and small decisions accumulate like gunpowder. Ferrus Manus, for his part, stood in his private forge more often. He watched men get patched and re-welded, and he found comfort in the clarity of torque tables and maintenance logs. He trusted therein a constancy that people denied him. Fulgrim strode the halls in robes and ornate armor, speaking as if the very world were a canvas awaiting embellishment. The men loved both for reasons that made sense to them. But two captains cannot steer the same ship if they set their stars differently. The seeds were sown. Roots, unseen, were taking hold. The thing that would break them was not yet visible, but it would grow from these strands: pride, preference, and the quiet human hunger to be remembered for more than mere survival. I, Gas Havelock, have watched such hunger turn saints into monsters and poets into tyrants. I have a memory of Fulgrim smiling at the edge of a battlefield as if it were his gallery, and of Ferrus staring at a casualty tally as if it were his liturgy. Both men were right in their way. Both were dangerously incomplete. It would take more than words to reconcile their differences. It would take more than counsel and reprimand. The galaxy is not patient with nuance. The next turn would be one of consequence, a decision, a weapon, an influence, a whisper stronger than brotherhood. They had drifted apart, not by animation of spite but by the slow weight of contradictory purposes. That drift would become a gulf, and in that gulf the iron hands would find themselves tested in ways that no workshop could have predicted. I write as one who has watched men become monuments and monuments become warnings. My hand shakes not from age, though it does, but from the memory of a single moment when brotherhood cracked and a blade sang a new name. I am Gas Havelock. If the first chapters were about forging and the second about fissures, then this chapter is about the contagion that crept along those cracks until the metal itself learned to rot, Fulgrim's fall into shadow, the blade that whispered, and the day Ferrus Manus stood at the threshold of impossible choice. It began, as such things do, with a thing that should have been negligible. A relic was recovered from the ruins of a dead world, a small, curved blade wrapped in a cadaver's shroud and engraved in a tongue no one remembered. The scholars who begged passages at Fulgrim's feet called the artifact exquisite. The more practical officers of the Iron Hands called it a curiosity to be catalogued. Ferrus, who had little taste for treasures that did not serve a function, was indifferent. That indifference was, in truth, a kind of prescience. He unearthed precursors to danger in the pattern of attention. Fulgrim's retinue, newly swollen with poets and iconographers, surrounded the relic as devotion surrounds a relic's altar. They compared lines and light in the blade as if it were an instrument of beauty rather than a thing with teeth. It is tempting to tell this part as inevitability, as if the blade, called later, in whispered revilings, the liar blade, had been waiting the whole galaxy round for Fulgrim's hand. But the truth is slipperier and more human. The blade was seductive because Fulgrim had already become susceptible. The seeds of doubt had become roots, the roots had pushed toward any nutrient that promised further elevation, language, praise, the sense of being chosen for something beyond duty. The liar blade arrived and found tonic in the man's hunger to be remarkable, to leave imprints beyond the counted lists of men returned or dead. Fulgrim took the blade with a solemnity wrapped in light. He held it in private at first, in rooms perfumed with oils and incense that the Legion's practical medics frowned upon. In those rooms the artists whispered. They gave the blade a history that fit the man's new hunger, that it had been sung of by a dying god, that it could reveal the truth of men by peeling away their facades. Such things do not convert men by force, they convert by promise. Fulgrim listened to the promises like a man with a thirst in a desert, and he believed with a fervor that made him radiant and terrible. The changes were incremental at first, subtle shifts in demeanor that could have been discarded as stress or the natural change of a man after a campaign. But Ferris was not a man who mistook small shifts for accidents. He catalogued behavior the way a surgeon reads scar tissue. Fulgrim's hands, which had once been adept at gesture and ceremonial flourish, began to tremble with a different energy. His orders, once easily parsed into function and field, grew cryptic to everyone but his inner retinue. Men with iron in their bones felt a foreign cold when Fulgrim spoke as if to an audience of phantoms. He began to read verses to his captains at night, verses that always circled back to transcendence and to the shedding of flesh for a higher truth. When some of the younger officers laughed off these nights as idiosyncrasy, older men exchanged glances long enough to be noticed. Worse was the blade. Weapons carry metaphors, but some weapons carry more. The lyre blade seemed to speak to Fulgrim, it reflected his image back to him with a kind of flattering cruelty. In private he would stand before polished metal and rehearse the gestures of a man who believed himself fated to remake the galaxy's taste. He invoked gods who were not in any doctrine the Empire taught, he spoke of a cleanliness wrought through choice rather than necessity. He argued, softly at first, then with a conviction that frightened those closest to him, that there was a right to remake men not merely through augmentations but through a shedding of the imperfect, through a purification that would end want and doubt. Ferris tried to reason with him, as men attempt to cool a fever with water. "You court risk for a spectacle," he said once in the privacy of Fulgrim's chambers. "You will not be the only one to fall for your own image." Fulgrim laughed then, a sound Ferris had never heard before. It was the laugh of a man who believed himself already beyond reproach. "You are always so literal," he told Ferris. "You count what is measurable and call it truth. I will not be hemmed in by your ledger. There are harmonies you cannot understand." "You will ask men to die for your harmonies," Ferris replied. "I will not watch that for the theater of it. There is a cruelty in being right about a thing and powerless to stop it." Ferris felt that cruelty like a heat against his chest. He tightened routines, increased the rigor of maintenance checks, argued for conservative maneuvers. Yet the contagion of Fulgrim's new purpose spread through the legion's veins with a grace that made instruments of the vulnerable. The artisans and rhetoricians placated fear with beauty, soldiers who craved to be more than tools were seduced by the romance of perfection. Fulgrim's manner became a lodestone for those who would accept his whispered liturgies. And then, like a sudden storm after a season of peculiar winds, the legion's informants came with a report that could not be dismissed as rumor. Fulgrim had made contact with emissaries whose sigils none in the Iron Hands recognized. They were not merchants, not diplomats. Their shapes were crooked with secrecy and their words were coated in promises of knowledge. The emissaries did not come empty-handed. In one encounter, a hooded figure presented Fulgrim with a mirror, and in that mirror Fulgrim saw an image of himself unbound by conscience, triumphant, made perfect by acts that the Empire would call treason. Fulgrim accepted the mirror as a man accepts an oracle. He drank the visions offered to him like a fever drink, and he began to make decisions in their name. When the first atrocities began, campaigns where the language of slaughter was married to the language of ceremony, Ferris felt his heart fracture. There is a difference between the necessary cruelty of war and cruelty that is rendered as worship. Fulgrim's forces began to enact displays in which the subjugation of a planet's population was staged as a rite. The victims were made to recite lines, their deaths were choreographed to heights meant to inspire. The Iron Hands could not stomach it. They were practical men who believed in the sanctity of efficiency, they did not invent pageants to soothe themselves. Ferris saw the danger writ plain, Fulgrim's path would harden the Legion in ways that would hollow it from the inside. He confronted Fulgrim on a black night in the courtyard of Fulgrim's palace, beneath a constellation that had always comforted them both in youth. The courtyard smelled of burning incense and of iron. Fulgrim stood at its center, the lyre blade in hand, and his face was lit by the glow of 1,000 small lamps. Around him his chosen retinue formed a ring, people who dressed like poets but held eyes like predators. Ferris walked into that ring and the air felt as if it had been altered by a spell. "For what purpose have you forgiven the devils you consort with?" Ferris asked, his voice a measured instrument. Fulgrim's smile was terrible in its gentleness. "I have found a way to transcend petty loyalties," he said. "I will not be hamstrung by the Empire's notion of order." "You call yourself a son of the Emperor and yet you make bargains that desecrate that name," Ferris said. "I call myself a son of possibility," Fulgrim replied. He raised the lyre blade and its edge winked in the light. "You talk of the Emperor as if his decrees were the only route to righteousness. There is more than order, there is a beauty to be found in choice. In the end, what is a life but an argument for a certain kind of meaning? I choose meaning." Ferris felt anger then, cold and precise. He stepped closer. "You choose a meaning that murders men for spectacle and offers the galaxy a lie." Fulgrim's expression collapsed into something like pity. "You confuse preservation with cowardice. You cannot see the art in sacrifice. You distort sacrifice into vanity," Ferris replied. "Where is the honor in making victims into set pieces?" "For you, honor is a ledger," Fulgrim said. "For me, honor is the song that outlives the ledger." They stood there for a long time, two shapes in argument that had once been one. Around them, the retinue murmured like insects. Ferris felt the old affection he had for Fulgrim like a weight, not the weight that anchors but the weight that binds. He remembered councils where they had sworn to one another with hands bloodied and repaired. He remembered the nights when Fulgrim sat with him and wrestled with the same ghosts Ferris had. He also remembered the faces of soldiers lost in fields needlessly emptied for the theater of it. The memory of both war and brotherhood sat between them like a third thing that might be judged only by action. Ferris was a man devoted to duty. He knew the law of the Emperor and the consequences for treason. He also knew, painfully, the intimate knowledge of a friend whose hand he had once steadied in surgery, whose soul, if such a word was permitted, had once been close enough for him to touch. In that courtyard he faced a choice that would haunt the rest of his days: to strike first in the name of duty, to sever a brother before he could sever everything else, or to attempt to redeem the man who had been his mirror since youth. He chose, at first, to speak. He offered Fulgrim the path back, he conjured memories of their shared past like relics in hopes of evoking grief. "Come home," he said. "Renounce these voices and let us fix what has been broken. The Emperor will not forgive treason, but a man who humbles himself might yet find redemption." Fulgrim listened like one hearing a quaint thing. "You speak of humility as if it were a cloak to be worn," he said. "I have seen the future in that mirror and it is not a cloak. It is a crown." The crown was a word that rang with ominous clarity. Ferris understood then that Fulgrim was no longer merely enamored with spectacle, he had been seduced by visions that made him believe himself chosen. Whatever human affection still resided in him had been cannibalized by a gloating zeal. The lyre blade had not so much corrupted as clarified a pre-existing hunger into a hunger for dominion. The confrontation did not end in blades that night. There was talk, threats, the slamming of a palm into a table as if to shatter the last of a brotherhood that had been hammered by different beaters. Fulgrim walked away with a soft, insolent bow as if to salute a stage. Ferris watched him go, and in the watching his logic began to retreat under the weight of a fear he could not quantify. He sent word to the Emperor's own council, writing reports that were clinical and damning. He petitioned for counsel, for officers to be summoned. He did what a man of law and order must do when the rules of the Republic were threatened. But counsel came slow, and the contagion moved faster. Fulgrim, sensing the tide of opposition, accelerated his plans. He began to form alliances with shadowed hosts, with cults whose words were sibilant and whose symbols twined like vines. The Emperor's network of intelligence, stretched across star systems and priorities, was slow to interpret the gravity of the threat. By the time the High Lords understood, Fulgrim had already declared himself not merely a rebel but a leader of a new, perverse liturgy. He named his movement many things: rebirth, perfection, the end of weakness. He claimed sovereignty for those who would follow his doctrine and wrath for those who would not. His voice was attractive to those who had always hungered for absolutes. It was intoxicating to men who longed for a new order that would crown their sacrifices with meaning. The Emperor's children, once allies and sometimes intimate in their design philosophies, became his most ardent believers. From their banner the first formal cry of defiance rang. Ferris responded as he must. He called the Iron Hands to muster. He framed the betrayal to his officers not as a personal quarrel but as a legal and moral necessity. The Emperor's will had been flouted, and the unity of the Imperium threatened. He marshaled logistical data, assembled field commanders, and prepared for the fights they did not desire. In private, he did not robe himself in rhetoric. He carried grief like gear, useful, weighty, necessary. Yet inside that armor of duty was a heart that still wavered. Ferris's love for Fulgrim had not been a child's fatuous thing. It had been tempered by work, by satisfaction, by the shared labors of making men whole. He found himself drafting orders with a hand that trembled not from fatigue but from the fear of loss. He rehearsed the words he would speak to men who would face the traitor once beloved as brother, how to make them understand that love and duty are sometimes contradictory, that loyalty to one must not break the loyalty to the many. As Fulgrim's banners darkened and his armies swelled, Ferris had one final hope, that the brother he had known, wounded, practical, flawed, would be visible within the man who now wielded the lyre blade. He dispatched envoys of peace, men who had once been Fulgrim's confidants, who could speak in the soft register of shared memory. The envoys returned with hollow faces. They had met a man who answered with riddles and who smiled as if he were tasting blood as if it were wine. Fulgrim's eyes were not the eyes of a man who could be easily recalled. The betrayal had become manifest. It was no longer rumor or argument, it was a war of meanings and men. Fulgrim's forces struck first at border holdings that had once been neutral, carving a line of audacity through the Imperium's map. His rhetoric injured the minds of those who listened, his blade injured the bodies of those who did not. Ferris, with the heavy realization that he was moving toward the most terrible of duties, ordered his legion to march. On the eve of departure, Ferris walked the corridors of his fortress alone, passing the arc smoke of forges and seeing in the softened light hands that had been mended by his own doctrine. He kissed, in the manner of men who are permitted such superstition, the edges of a prosthetic plate that had once been a comrade's broken cheek. He spoke not to the men, but to the idea they embodied. "Hold fast," he murmured. "Do not be seduced by the gleam of things that call themselves truth." He had, in his chest, a private grievance larger than any military file, the sense that a brother's vanity had not only endangered men but had also turned the very concept of perfection into a weapon. He had taught men to believe that they could be improved. Fulgrim had decided that improvement required annihilation. When the Iron Hands mustered, their ranks were as stern and grim as ever. Their augmentations hummed in the dark with the promise of function. Ferris stood among them like the lugged anvil at the center of a labor. He did not make fiery speeches, he never had. He spoke with the vocabulary of duty and maintenance, logistics, cohesion, calculation. But his eyes flickered to the horizon where the banners of Fulgrim already stirred in the wind, new and terrible. He knew, in some small place he tried to deny, that the decision he had made would mark him. Whether history blessed him for defending law or damned him for the killing of a brother, it would not matter to the dead who would emerge from the fields. He prepared not for glory but for the arithmetic of survival. How many men must be spared to maintain the lineage of the Iron Hands, how to shield the future against the corrosion of ideology. The betrayal of Fulgrim had coalesced into a stark truth: a brother he loved had become an enemy he must oppose. Ferris Manus, who had prided himself on the clarity of engineering and the practical repair of wounds, found his hands dirty with the more intractable work of pain. He stood on the cusp of action, feeling the press of the lyre blade's shadow. That night, he dreamed, briefly, of the early days when he and Fulgrim sat beneath a sky not yet rent by war, sketching maps and polishing blades with the mutual satisfaction of craftsmen. In the morning the dream evaporated like oil under flame. He had vows to keep and men to protect. Duty, and the memory of wounds and repairs, carried him forward. The chapter closes on the march. The legion moved out beneath iron skies, with Ferris at its head, and with a private ache clenched in his chest. He had done what needed doing, or so he told himself. Perhaps that would be truth enough. Perhaps truth would be measured in the cost of lives and the silence of men who no longer sang because their throats had been silenced for a perfection that promised them an impossible immortality. The betrayal had been revealed, the war had been called. Between Ferris and Fulgrim now stood not only armies but the unbridgeable gulf of choices made in different languages. The blade had been named, the brother had been lost. The next chapters would contain more killing and more lamenting, but for now I record the moment when devotion and doctrine diverged, when the lyre blade's whisper became a shout across the living world. I write this chapter with hands that still remember the weight of a pen as if it were a scalpel. There are moments in history whose sound is not a boom but a long, low groan, a planet's crust yielding under too much pressure, a people's conviction beginning to fracture. Eastvan 5 was such a place. It was a plain ringed by black hills and salt flats that reflected the sky like shattered glass. Its horizon was an iron line where stormlight and cannon smoke blurred into one. We called it the place where brotherhood was measured in blood and the calculus of war failed to account for what men will do when love becomes rage. The mustering of men was an industry of preparation. The Iron Hands regiments tightened their harnesses, their augmentations clicked and settled, weld smoke wreathing the field for 1,000 palms worth of distance. Ferris stood among them as one stands amid the anvil sparks, steady, deliberate, an image of competence that steadied others. He issued no grand oratory, his words were careful, technical, precise. That was his armor and his fault. Where others might have inflamed their troops with fury, Ferris armed them with plans, timelines, logistics, comms redundancies, because he still believed that clarity could save flesh. Fulgrim's banners, meanwhile, arrived like a fevered sunrise, immaculate, impossible, and edged with a light that did not belong to any honest dawn. The Emperor's children moved with the choreography of a court-martial painted as theater. They wore their cruelties as jewelry, their wounds as ornamentation. Around Fulgrim himself there swirled an aura not of simple command but of worship. His priests and rhetoricians had learned to make massacre look like sacrament. The lyre blade was at his hip like a guileful lover, it winked in the same light as his smile and whispered promises to those who would listen. Yet even in that terrible symmetry, the reality of war is arithmetic and friction. Eastvan 5 had choke points that would be revealed on the third day of fighting, supply columns that needed to be threaded through narrow valleys, civilians huddled beneath the shadows of ruined villages whose presence complicated the tidy ideals that had been preached on both sides. It was the sort of battlefield that favored methodical minds like Ferris's, and punished grand gestures that left seams in the line. The first days were the grinding of metronomes. Artillery lines were laid like scalpel guides, to be used precisely. Iron Hands platoons moved like machines, their augmentations humming to a dedicated rhythm. They did not sing. They measured supply consumption and scheduled field forge repairs with an almost liturgical reverence. Fulgrim's forces, in contrast, staged assaults that snapped like polished sabers through the air, sharp, fatal, and designed to be remembered. At first both methods yielded ground and blood in numbers that could be counted, justified, and logged. Then Fulgrim struck at a flank that Ferris had consciously left thin because the engineer primate believed the ground too costly to throw men upon. Fulgrim's charge was a blade of thunder and art, it cleaved through a holding unit of the Iron Hands' opponents in a flourish that drew cheers even in the middle of carnage. From orbit and from the ridgelines Fulgrim's assault read as poetry, a decisive stroke that would occupy legend. But what Ferris had feared was that a flourish, even if successful, would encourage risk elsewhere. And so it did. Men began to expect masterpiece where maintenance had once been the currency of survival. As the battle grew, so did the noise, not only of ordnance but of the thoughts that pursued Ferris. He had not been naive in the months before. He had watched Fulgrim flirt with excess and flirt with forces that were not of the Emperor's counsel. Yet the sight of his brother leading such artful slaughter calved something in Ferris that logic did not capture, a private, smoldering accusation that Fulgrim had made this war into a vanity fair and that vanity had a price measured in iron and bone. It was during the third day, in a low, brittle rain that turned the salt plains into a mirror smeared with mud, that the turning came. Scouts reported unusual troop movements, shifts in coloration at the periphery, concentrations of forces hidden by the shallow folds of the land. Ferris convened his commanders beneath a canvas sprayed with condensation, poring over the maps with practiced hands. His mind moved like a trained instrument across the symbols, reserve placements, flanking vectors, expected attrition. He noted the variables and prepared contingencies. At the edge of his vision the hum of his augmentation sounded steady. The world was, for a moment, plausible. Then a field report flicked into his hands like a hot coal. An aerial relay had picked up a seal of signal bursts, a pattern not typical of battle comms but of something more intimate and precise. Fulgrim's stroke was not simply directed at taking ground. In a calculated move that smelled of mad genius and religious fury, Fulgrim's commanders had arranged for a feint that would draw Ferris's reserves to a location from which they would be unable to return in time to protect the southern pass, the pass upon which the Iron Hand's entire line of retreat depended. Ferris felt a coldness inside him that was not the rational chill of a man parsing odds. It was a heat that moved like a biological instinct, immediate and corrosive. He remembered, as if that memory were a physical object he could pick up, the night he had begged Fulgrim to come to reason, come home. Fulgrim's smile, that terrible, spacious smile, returned unbidden to the forefront of his mind. The sense of betrayal was a pressure that tightened his jaw and set his hands to action in a way he would later call foolish. He could have followed his own contingency plan. He could have withheld the reserves, tightened the line, and allowed additional losses in the moment for the sake of overall survival. His kind of calculus favored delay over devastation. But betrayal sears the centers that logic cannot reach. Ferris saw not merely a tactical feint but an insult aimed at the marriage of craft and loyalty that had defined his life. The idea that Fulgrim would gamble with the lives of men for spectacle lit a fire he could not, in that instant, control. Ferris gave an order that would later be examined by councils and chroniclers and he would not be able to live down. He committed the reserves to a counterstroke meant to punish the Grand Theatre and to demonstrate, in a single decisive moment, the seriousness of duty. The order was not merely tactical, it was a moral retort. He would answer a blade in showmanship with the blunt truth of sacrifice. The counterstrike began with fury. Iron Hand's veterans moved as one, their augmentations dampening recoil and synchronizing servos so that volley preceded advance. For a time it seemed the action would succeed. They battered through the feint, turning it into raw attrition. Fulgrim's supporters, taken by surprise, bled spectacularly. The sight of Iron Hand stepping through the smoke with methodical, deadly efficiency ignited a thunderous grim satisfaction in Ferris, a vindication of his creed and a reassertion of the law that reason must govern sacrifice. But grief is a treacherous ally. Where Ferris had expected a swift correction, the battle's geometry refused to be reoriented by a single chord. Pockets of enemy forces that had been waiting in the folds of the land, forces that Fulgrim had quietly embedded like teeth in the jaw, rose and bit. Ferris's reserves, having been committed to a moral show of force, were now exposed. Communications were glitched under the storm, supply convoys were delayed by the mud that clung like guilt to the chassis of heavy transports. The line stretched thin in places Ferris had not intended to stretch. Men who had been his to protect now found themselves bled in ways that could have been avoided. He felt the first true fracture in his certainty as he watched a column legendary in his memory, men whose arms he had personally seen weld and whose eyes he had checked for steadiness, stagger and then fall. He tasted the iron tang of their blood in the rain as if the sky itself had opened for them. Rage rose like an ocean and drowned planning. His mind shuddered on a single axis. Fulgrim must be stopped. He would not watch the man he had once called brother turn the world into a gallery of corpses. So Ferris rode forward, alone at first, then with a handful of captains who would not be refused. That decision was a crack in the great machine of his doctrine. It was rendered by a different metric, the need for personal resolution over distributed responsibility. It was the tragic flaw, boiled down, pride turned to righteous fury, and righteous fury made him reckless. He cut through the smoke toward Fulgrim's colors. The battlefield around him was a moving tapestry of men and metal, the air thick with burned oil, shouted orders, and the sharp clatter of parry and impact. Fulgrim's soldiers, trained in something more, then already honed into a cult, saw Ferris's approach and parted, creating a corridor for the two primarchs to meet. It was as if the field itself, for a moment, cleared to allow a final reckoning. Men on both sides watched and fought simultaneously, but every eye seemed to check the two figures at the center, one a temple of strict engineering, the other crowned by a blade that sang blasphemous hymns. When Ferris and Fulgrim stood within arm's length, the world seemed both absurdly small and intolerably vast. The rain struck their armor and steamed. Ferris's face was a mask of metal and anger. Fulgrim looked, paradoxically, like a celebrated painter who had been interrupted mid-gesture. Around them men died like struck instruments, but for a sliver of time the noise narrowed to the breathing of the two former brothers. "You have made what we built into an altar for your vanity," Ferris said. His voice, blunt as a hammer, trembled only in the places where grief broke through. Fulgrim's smile did not fade. He set the lyre blade so that it caught the rain into a glittering thread. "And you have made craft into a religion of fear," he replied softly. "You cannot see how small you are in the world of the possible." Ferris answered with a motion that was half command and half plea. "Stand down, Fulgrim. End this." Fulgrim tipped his head. "And if I do, what will remain of me? A man without an audience is no man at all. I will not be diminished for your ledger." The duel that followed was not a simple clash of steel. In the rain, in the roar of war, the two men exchanged not only blows but memories. Every strike Ferris made carried the force of thousands of calculations, angles, torque, the surety of a joint replaced 1,000 times. But Ferris's blows also carried the heat of betrayal. They were not merely efficient, they were embattled with emotion. Fulgrim's counters were exquisite, shaped by a mind that had learned to carve glory out of slaughter. His parries were as much performance as defense, and the lyre blade sang as if it were an instrument of vindication. For a time the duel looked even, two master craftsmen pitting different aesthetics against one another. Ferris landed blows that would have felled lesser men. Fulgrim dodged and responded with cuts that left the air tasting of ozone. Around them, their soldiers fighting dimmed into the periphery, as if this contest were the pivot on which the world turned. But Ferris's rage had altered his rhythm. His strikes grew heavier, less precise. He drove the lyre blade back again and again, trying not only to wound but to deny Fulgrim the pleasure of an elegant counter. He invoked the worst parts of his creed, force without finesse, and in doing so he opened the small slits that the lyre blade, by design, learned to find. Fulgrim was not immune to the blade's gift. Its whispers were in his mind, making him bolder than he might otherwise have been and kinder to his own cruelty. He circled Ferris with the confidence of a man who had chosen a path and enjoyed the consequences. When Fulgrim found an opening, it was not the opening of a coldly calculated machine but the opening made possible by the other man's emotion. He struck, and the lyre blade's edge found the seam between armor plates at a place Ferris's mechanical intuition should have protected. It was not simply a test of metallurgy, it was a test of human error. The blow that followed ruptured the narrative of Ferris's certainty. The blade slipped past a weld, pierced the junction of joint and augmentation, and there was a smell, sharp, like ozone and burned wiring, that I will never forget. Ferris staggered back. A cry rose from the men at the edges of the duel, a sound between agony and awe. For an instant Ferris looked as if he would laugh, rage and pain and the ridiculousness of his own vanity mingled on his lips. Then he did the only thing he could do, he answered in kind. He lunged again, not with the cool method of an engineer but with the fury of a betrayed brother. The wound had not yet bled enough to sap him, but it had stolen his edge. Blood and coolant mixed where the wound had pierced, the iron of his systems reacting with the blood of his humanity in a grotesque, sacred alchemy. He struck, and his hand closed on Fulgrim's blade. There was a moment, tremulous and vast, when their hands met around the weapon. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Ferris's vision filled with flashes, the two of them as boys arguing over a blade, them laughing in the sand of a forge, joints soldered, pages of maps traced together in candlelight. He remembered Fulgrim's smile in its old warmth and tasted guilt like rust. "Remember," Ferris breathed, "whether as plea or accusation I cannot say." Fulgrim's face changed then, and for a second I believed that grieving could pierce the shell that had formed around him. The lyre blade quivered in the clasp. Perhaps, for a sliver of time, the man inside the cultist's robes still lingered. But the blade's whisper was stronger than the memory. It sang that the future favored its path and that anything that stood in the way of culmination must be broken. Fulgrim's fingers tightened with the soft cruelty of a man accepting a bargain. He twisted. The motion was exquisitely cruel, an artist's final flourish. The lyre blade slid, and where it found purchase the joint that was Ferris's pride gave way. The sound was small but absolute, the snapping of covenant into fracture. Ferris's eyes widened, the way eyes widen when they look at an impossible truth. He tried to pull his hand free, but the lyre blade held like a promise. "Forgive me," Ferris said, more to himself than to Fulgrim. His voice had lost some of its construction, it was ragged and full of the small, human things he had tried so hard to iron out with doctrine. Fulgrim bent close, his face an illumination by the sword's edge. "You were always admirable, brother," he said, "but there was no pity in it. You were precise to the point of paralysis. You could not forgive the beautiful because it made you afraid." Ferris tried to answer but could only cough. The battlefield around them blurred into a smear of color and sound. He felt the life that had once been so neat, a ledger of causes and effects, slipping into messy, stubborn emotion. Pride, that last great lever, pushed him to one final motion. If he could not unmake what had been done, he would force at least the cost of it into the ledger of the enemy. He pulled, he twisted, he summoned from the reserve of will that had carried men through forges and surgeries and cruel winters. He planted a boot, he braced his shoulder, he drove forward with a motion that was part machine's resolve and part human desperation. He closed with Fulgrim. The two bodies collided and gnashed like old friends finally let loose. For a moment the force of their crash sent a ripple through the line, men faltered, then fought on. Ferris drove his shoulder, drove his remaining strength, and for an instant, an almost obscene flash of hope, the lyre blade slipped from Fulgrim's fingers and clattered into the mud between them. It was then, in that thin seam of possibility, that Ferris' tragic flaw completed its cruel work. He had committed himself wholly to the personal catharsis of disarming his brother, he had pulled his reserves into the moral theater, he had trusted that his single act could re-establish the moral law. But war does not yield to single acts of valor when systems are broken. A splinter squad that had been hiding in the shallow ravine, placed there, cunningly, by Fulgrim's stratagem, rose and poured gunfire into Ferris's flank. He had overreached. He had allowed his personal vendetta to expose him to the knives of a strategist who had prepared for the very moment he showed himself human. Bullets chewed through augmented limbs, servo-assist whined and failed. Ferris felt, with a clarity no engineer enjoys, how much of the body is habit and how much is mechanical. Metal failed where metal had been made subservient to pride. He threw himself at Fulgrim again, not because he could not see the futility but because the only thing left to him was the attempt to reconcile his honor in an act that meant nothing to doctrine but everything to his soul. Fulgrim watched the scene with the terrible composure of a man who had rehearsed his triumph. He raised the lyre blade with a slow, ceremonious motion. The blade fell. Time shrank to the sound of a single breath breaking. The blow made contact at the base of Ferris's neck, where augmentation met bone and where the last custodians of human flesh lived like an island of frailty. The instrument that had once repaired limbs now surrendered in a small, exquisite failure. Ferris' eyes, always such windows of measured intent, went slack with the recognition that he had been outplayed not just in battle but in the moral theater he had insisted upon. He fell forward into the mud, the world giving way beneath him as if even the ground sought to absolve him from its cruelty. The rain washed foreign oil and blood into the same dark stream. Around them men continued to fight, but a hush had fallen on many faces. Comrades recognized in Ferris' fall not only the death of a leader but the death of a certain stubborn logic that had once guided them. In his last consciousness Ferris felt a curious blend of pride and sorrow, pride that he had stood by his belief in protection, sorrow that his belief had been poisoned into a demand that had cost lives. Fulgrim stood above him, the lyre blade dripping with rain and something like felicity. He did not speak now of promise or prophecy. His face was a mask of the cool artist who has finally had his sculpture come to life. "You could not see past the ledger," he said softly, as if to teach a lesson that would be carved into the bones of the world. Ferris tried to form words, but they were small and fugitive. He thought of metal and men, of forges and the quiet rooms where surgeons had stitched sinew into new strength. He thought of Fulgrim's laugh when younger, of the night they had etched their names into a brazier's rim. He thought of men he had saved with an iron hand and of those he could not save because he had been too blinded by the necessity of answer. He felt, clearer than any equation, the raw, human regret of a man who had traded cautious calculation for a single, unsparing emotion. "There is no ledger big enough," he whispered, a phrase that seemed absurdly inadequate to the moment. He had meant more than it sounded. There were costs that could not be reconciled by accounting. And perhaps that is the only final truth he left. We account for men in numbers and sometimes forget that numbers are also faces. Then the darkness came. The mud swallowed sight and sound folded into the soft, inevitable whir of dying servos. Ferris Manus, the hammer, the engineer, the man who had tried to excise weakness with scalpel precision, died with the sense of a world that had misread itself. Fulgrim did not celebrate in the manner of a common victor. He lingered a moment over Ferris's body, and in that hovering there was perhaps a shadow of something like remorse, an echo of the brother he had once been. It did not last. He turned away with the effortless grace he had always carried, and the spectacle became, for those who watched, both an end and a beginning. The Emperor's children surged with the exultant cruelty of those who have found a new god in the making of pain. The immediate aftermath of Ferris's death was not simple. The iron hands did not collapse into chaos. They were, by temperament and design, a structure of such resilience that even the loss of a primarch could not dissolve them overnight. But the manner of the loss, the anger-driven gambit, the personal vendetta that had exposed lines, the failure to keep reserves safe, left a wound deeper than any blade could cut. Men who had followed Ferris for his discipline now understood the price of his pride. Some carried that knowledge as shame, others as a hardened resolve to avoid the same pitfall. I watched those days as I have watched many funerals where the dead are not merely buried but mapped into doctrine. There were recriminations on both sides, officers who argued that Ferris's hunger for justice had been necessary, voices who insisted that no compromise could have been struck with Fulgrim's new religion. There were men who could only weep, not because they had lost a leader but because they had lost a brother in whom they had trusted. Fulgrim, for his part, proceeded with the cold efficiency of a man who had planned the end from the beginning. He ordered deeds done that made his rebellion seem not merely a revolt but a reformation. The lyre blade's shadow stretched across the battlefield and beyond. Istvan V became a scar on the face of the galaxy, a name men used to warn and to curse, to vindicate or to grieve. In the quiet that followed, I walked among the survivors. I saw hands still stained with the mixture of oil and blood, faces older from a night. I listened as men spoke in low voices about Ferris, about the way he had ordered the forge to be doubled in a siege so that wounded men could be returned to the line, about his odd tenderness in the midst of brutality. I heard the sentence repeated often, "He saved us as he could, until he could not save himself." There is a lesson that history often repeats with cruel insistence. the virtue that saves can also be the virtue that destroys when asked to shoulder the weight of private retribution. Ferrus Manus saved thousands by teaching them how to replace the frailties of flesh with the stability of alloy, but the same certainty in his doctrine that demanded rescue and repair could not protect him from a wound inflicted by the human heart. Istvan V closed with no clean victory. Planets were lost, populations decimated, and both sides carried away the seed of future wars. Fulgrim had won in the narrow sense, he had slain the man who might have stopped his ascension, but the cost to the fabric of the Imperium was incalculable. The Iron Hands stood altered, bereaved, and more mechanistic than they had been. The echo of Ferrus's work lived on in their augmented limbs and in the clinics that continued to stitch men back into service. But his death, violent, personal, and tragic, left an imprint that was not easily healed. I put down my pen now not as one who seeks to judge by easy standards but as a man who has held both the ledger and the brazier and understands their different truths. Ferrus Manus's fault was not that he loved discipline, it was that he allowed the love of discipline to be the instrument of a very human tragedy. He met his brother with all the force that made him great, and it was precisely that force, untempered by the humility he sometimes pretended to have, that brought him low. Istvan V remained after the smoke, a place where the measure of a man could not be reduced to equations, where the machinery of perfection met the unpredictability of love and betrayal. In the end, the tragedy was not merely that a primarch died, it was that two brothers, once allied in the shaping of men, found themselves turned into final instruments of one another's ruin. I write these pages with hands that still tremble from Istvan's mud. That battlefield left its grammar on my skin, the smell of hot oil and blood, the sound of servos dying like the final exhalations of animals not meant to be machines. If the fourth chapter closed with a blow, this chapter opens with aftermath, the cold arithmetic of loss and the slow, deliberate rebirth that follows a thing smashed and held together again by welded intent. I am Gas Havelock. I have watched towns bury their dead, I have watched forges turn ash into new tools. But I had not expected the Iron Hands to bury a primarch and then, as if in a fever, to begin remaking themselves into something I could not have predicted. Istvan V did not yield its dead in neat rows. The field was a map of broken geometry, coves where bodies had been heaped like scrap, half-crushed banners, and machinery whose innards had been chewed by bolt and blade. For days after the fighting ceased, small groups of Iron Hands worked the ground with the same solemnity and precision they had once used to fit a joint. They recovered the bodies of brothers where they lay, hoisting them with harnesses and placing them upon pallets. There were no wails, there were catalogues. Each fallen was checked for rank, augmentations inventoried, gene seed samples taken to the apothecaries. The human need to cry existed in private corners, in public the Legion converted grief into protocols. It is a paradox, a people schooled to repair and replace will manage mourning as another process to be mastered. Ferrus Manus's body, what remained of it, was handled with a liturgical care that could have been mistaken for devotion. Where other cultures burn the body or entomb it with songs, the Iron Hands performed the last welding. It was not spectacle. It was a ceremony of maintenance writ large, Ferrus' body placed upon a dais slab, forges circling like orbiting moons, tech priests in their soot-laced robes checking weld seams and the angulation of prosthetic housings. They did not attempt to resurrect what was irreparably lost, instead they affixed plates and bolted commemorative plaques, and in doing so they made the death into an object that could be inspected, catalogued, and learned from. This was for them a way of saying what they could not say with words: we will convert your failure into knowledge. Even in these first hours, the psychic shock radiated outward. Men who had followed Ferrus his entire lives, sergeants who had been welded by his hand and librarians who had carried his decrees, stared at the sky as if it had been struck. Some turned their faces away from the sun and chose silence. Others, quieter and perhaps more dangerous, turned inward and began a mechanical purging of sentiment. A few of these were the men who would take the reins of leadership. The Primarch's absence left a logical vacuum as much as an emotional abyss. Someone had to decide what the Iron Hands were to become. That decision came, in formal shape, as the Iron Council. It was not an instant creation. Councils form like cooling metal, slowly, drilling into the structure until a seam is chiseled. The Iron Council did not convene in a chamber ringed with banners, it met in the heart of a working forge, the rasp of grinders setting a metronome to the conversation. Its membership was notable: tech marines whose hands smelled of flux and oil, captains who had the permanent lines of command etched into their faces, and apothecaries who carried the quiet gravity of men who keep life's seed in vials. I watched them, once official, then unofficial, assemble around a table hacked from the rim of a blasted engine. Their first acts were procedural: inventories, reassignment of commands, deployment directives. But beneath the paper was an argument of philosophy. Ferris's legacy was both problem and template. He had taught them to fix men, to temper the frail into the durable. Now, bereft of their muscle and voice, they had to decide whether to continue in the same vein or to accelerate toward the purity of his creed, excise weakness at any cost. There were voices of restraint, officers who feared that surrendering too much of their humanity would erode what held them together. There were voices of action, men who argued that Ferris's death had shown the cost of allowing human error to persist. The council did not speak of humanity in sentimental terms. They spoke of failure rates, of torque tolerances, of variables that had yielded catastrophic losses at East Van 5. They drafted a plan, the grand calculation, that read like a war manual and a prayer at once. It was a compendium of rules, a rubric for acceptable loss, and, crucially, a framework for transforming the Legion's culture into one where emotion was recognized, measured, and minimized. The grand calculation included mandatory augmentations for those who had not yet been fully redlined, new protocols for mental screening, a formalized system for adjudicating unnecessary risk, and a directive that the maintenance of prostheses was to be elevated to ritual rank. There were no illusions that this process would be comforting. Many men, especially veterans who had served under Ferris's direct command, felt this march toward mechanization as a betrayal of a different kind. Ferris had believed in augmentations as instruments, not replacements for the soul. The council's measures implied the soul was either superfluous or a liability. Some interpreted Ferris's death as proof that human error, pride, love, grief, was the root cause of their downfall. For them, the council's path made grim sense: remove the unpredictability, and you remove betrayal. One of the council's earliest and most contentious moves was political: the decentralization of primarchal authority into collective governance. The Iron Council would be the sum of its parts, no single voice carrying the totality of command as Ferris had. There were reasons practical and psychological for this: a single primarch is a figure that can be targeted, seduced, or seduced into hubris. The council would distribute responsibility, enforce redundancy in the chain of command, and codify checks that Ferris's singular authority had not required. The trade-off was clear: unity over personality. They would be harder to break but colder to know. Grief took many forms among the survivors. I spoke at length, often in whispered hours, to men who had once stood at Ferris's side. Captain Thane, a man whose jaw had always been a set of regulated angles, sat in a shadowed locker room and pressed his palm to the scar where a hand had been welded. He taught me to worry about the correct angle of leverage, Thane told me, voice low. He taught me to love the job more than the applause. I cannot decide whether the council is wise or whether wisdom now will look to steel rather than brotherhood. Thane's ambiguity was common. Many felt the council's logic as both solution and theft. There were the apothecaries who took their work as if in service to both Ferris and to the future. Apothecary Marek became visible to me in the weeks after East Van 5, moving through the camps with small glass phials and a careful hand. Where others carried plaques, Marek carried names. He argued in council for preserving the memory of Ferris not as doctrine but as case study, to translate the man's decisions into protocols without sanctifying them into dogma. His voice was one of the few that pleaded for a conservatism of spirit, an insistence that not every sorrow should be engineered away. But the momentum toward mechanization was formidable. New clinics were opened with a speed that suggested both urgency and a shape of grief. men queued to be fitted with plates for injuries they did not yet possess, recruits shaved their heads and accepted ocular plugs with an eagerness that startled older veterans. Rituals once private became communal. The welder's oath, once a technical recitation, was transformed into a litany chanted at the beginning of each augmentation. The language changed subtly. Where once a man might speak of repair, he now spoke of improvement, and improvement was moralized. Weakness became an ethical stain. The Iron Hand's transformation was not only physical but also cognitive. New training regimens emphasized predictive failure modeling. Where intuition had once been a skill valued for its speed in battle, now analytics and redundancy were enshrined. The council constructed libraries of failed engagements. East Van 5 held a place of prominence, and required officers to study them as if they were scripture. The synthesis of these studies went beyond tactics. The Iron Hands built machines that could map the emotional tenor of a unit and recommend interventions. It is a chilling thing to watch a community domesticate sorrow into a report. One afternoon I watched a ceremony I will not easily forget. It was at the main forge, where the forges that had cooled and then flared anew fed a ring of men. Each veteran brought a personal relic, often a scrap of their former flesh's history, a dented breastplate, a chunk of wire that had once been a tendon replacement, a metal forged in simpler times. They laid these items upon a communal anvil. Tech Marines chanted as they heated the objects and welded them together into a single bar of metal. The bar would be inspected, then distributed as a bracelet to each of the attendees, a token that bound the men not to sentiment but to shared maintenance, a reminder that every object of value is subject to stress and must be monitored. The symbolism was stark, memory preserved by conversion to function. They called the ceremony the binding of remnants. Gas Havelock the chronicler is not neutral by training, I admit to sympathy. I found the binding both beautiful and terrible. I recognized, in the ring of men and the heat of the forge, a nobility. I also saw a renunciation. By making grief into a tool, by binding memory to maintenance, the Iron Hands were altering the substrate of identity. Where before a comrade's death might be remembered in stories told softly over years, now it would be encoded into procedure. Loss would become reproducible. The human story became protocol. The personal grief of those who survived did not vanish. It was masked, redirected, and in some corners it festered. A small cabal of veterans, men who had been Ferris's inner circle, gathered in the evenings in a storage vault that still smelled of hot metal. They drank solvent and spoke in tones that ranged from prayer to accusation. Some blamed themselves. What had they missed in the turning of Fulgrim? Others blamed the universe, or the emperor, or the very idea that any man could be made into an unerring thing. One of these veterans, Brother Sergeant Corr, kept a ledger of small acts of kindness Ferris had shown, times he refused to spare a blade at a beggar's plea, moments when he had repaired not for the war but for the comfort of a brother. Corr read to the small group from those pages until men's eyes were wet with the memory of his voice. These gatherings were not council-sanctioned. They were the last places of unengineered feeling. The apothecaries argued for such spaces to be protected, even as the council established metrics for emotional regulation. Marek, for his part, began a private project, a codex of small human acts. He told me, when I visited him in the quiet of his lab, that Ferris had valued these acts so much that they needed to be preserved, even if only as a counterweight to the grand calculation. We cannot allow the ledger to become the only way we measure worth, he said. Otherwise we will lose not merely our flaws but the reasons we once mended them. But in the cold calculus of politics and survival, such voices were minority counsel. The majority, frightened and resolute, dove further into the machine. Over months, the Legion's aesthetics shifted. Color was drained from banners, ornamentation that could catch an enemy's eye was scrubbed. Helm crests were simplified, heraldry sharpened into symbols that spoke of function, a hand over a gear, a joint enfolded in line art. Even the language of address changed, where soldiers had once called one another brother, in a tone that implied familiarity, they now used ranks and identifiers. The warmth of small intimacy was not outlawed but discouraged. it was corrosive to the new principle, no weakness. I will not pretend the shift produced unanimity. There were pockets of resistance, men who sang songs of Ferris in the mess halls, artists who smuggled carved things into the forge wards and hid them under floorboards. A small guild of carvers continued in secret to produce things that had no military function, tiny wooden figures, a painted stone, a music box that played in a key no ledger recognized. These were not tolerated, they were dangerous. Yet they persisted, for need makes rebels out of the sentimental as much as out of the political. The Iron Council watched this all with clinical interest. They commissioned studies into the rate of descent and found the numbers instructive. A small percentage of pockets of romanticism remained, but they were not destabilizing. The council chose a policy of containment, allow small, private acts as long as they did not affect operational readiness. The message to all was clear: feel, if you must, quietly, live, if you must, within protocols, and keep your hands clean of unnecessary actions. As the months passed, the Legion did rebuild. Their new clinics produced stronger joints and more reliable augmentations. Their fighting doctrine, already methodical, became more aggressive in its insistence on redundancy. The Iron Hands lost what they had been in public warmth but gained a grim ability to survive attrition that other legions would envy. Readers of my chronicle will argue endlessly whether this was moral triumph or ethical failure. I will only say what I saw: the men who remained at the front were harder to break, and that hardness had cost them something that could not be measured in augments alone. My own pen wrestled with the duty of recording. How does one chronicle a people while lyricizing what might be their undoing? I walked often to Ferris's private forge in those months. It was sealed to public view, preserved as a place of memory and study. The anvil was cold and yet the imprint of certain hands was still visible upon its surface. Oils had soaked into the grain. I would sit there and try to reconcile the man who had loved both craft and men with the collective that now worshipped craft more fiercely than company. I tried to write without condemnation and without sentimental absolution. I failed sometimes, because my grief is human and my admiration for craft is large. I also found myself recording small paradoxes that might be lost to strict accounts. The Iron Hands, even as they shed warmth, continued to honor certain small courtesies that Ferris had valued: the exactness of an officer's signature, the precise order of a burial slate, the insistence that even a prosthetic be properly oiled. In this way, Ferris's method endured, transformed into ritual, perhaps, but still present. You could say he was being remembered in the very way he would have preferred, as a standard to be met, a problem to solve. The latter half of this chapter is not meant to absolve the council or to mask the loneliness of the survivors. The Iron Hands had been reborn as something sharper and more efficient, less given to what we call softness. They wrote new oaths into their code, and those oaths bound them to an almost fanatical pursuit of eliminating failure. They called their new era the calculation, a phrase that I find both chilling and honest. Calculation implies exclusion of the unpredictable. It implies that the measure of a man is the percentage chance he will continue to serve. Perhaps that is why, in secret, some men still come to the old forge and whisper. They tell me they fear that in the elimination of weakness they may have excised mercy itself. If mercy is not engineered, they ask, who will value what cannot be measured? I do not have an easy answer. History seldom rewards easy certainty. I close this chapter with a quiet confession. Ferris Manus's name is on many plaques now. His doctrines are both weapon and bomb to the Iron Hands. The men rebuild their instruments, polish their plates, and swear oaths calculated to prevent future betrayals. They are formidable and colder, they are more precise and less forgiving. Where once the sound of a man's laugh was a measure of morale, now the whir of a well-oiled servo is praise enough. As a chronicler, I will continue to record. As a man, I will continue to mourn. I am haunted by a question that no counsel could measure: whether a soul, however flawed, is worth the price of being made utterly dependable. The Iron Hands chose a course born of grief and logic. They turned Ferris's death into data, and that may well be what saved them from annihilation. But in the quiet moments when the forges cool and the men sleep fitfully beneath their layered plates, I hear the small echoes of laughter and remember that the man they lost loved both hammer and brother. The rebirth is real, it is efficient and terrible. Whether it is resurrection or erasure is for time to test, and for me to record with a pen that trembles, but will not stop. I am Gas Havelock, and I have learned to measure the weight of history in the silence that follows the stamping of boots. The years after Istvan V were not a gentle span but a hard calculus, one of time and torque, grief and ordnance, during which the iron hands remade themselves into something both more efficient and more terrible than I had previously imagined. If the council's name, Grand Calculation, sounded like docketing a problem for later, do not be deceived, it was not an idle formality. It became law, ritual, machine and religion, all braided into one relentless program. In that program the old music of Ferrus Manus remained as a faint motif, it was a melody rerouted through gears. To speak of the rebirth is to speak of focus. Where once the legion's energies were divided between maintenance, warfare, and the small private courtesies that make a body of men a brotherhood, the post-heresy iron hands concentrated their purpose into a single axis, the removal of weakness. Weakness was no longer merely an injury to be repaired. It was a fault to be detected, modeled, and eliminated. The Grand Calculation converted moral philosophy into executable processes. It began as pages of doctrine, formulas for acceptable loss, flowcharts for command redundancy, and ended as something we could observe physically, clinics producing standardized prosthetics, synaptic dampeners calibrated to reduce impulsive rage, training regimens rewritten as drills whose outcomes could be simulated and validated before they were ever enacted. The council encoded Ferrus's original credo, "Flesh is weak," into an operational grammar that left little room for ambiguity. Where Ferrus once had argued for augmentation as a compassionate correction, the council enshrined augmentation as a compulsory prophylactic. A citizen soldier with a susceptibility to failure would be reclassified and scheduled for modification. The rites that surrounded the acts of replacement were clinical and public. I watched whole barracks file past arrays of tech priests who inspected and stamped prostheses the way earlier generations had blessed relics. Boys who might once have carried their father's stories into the mess now carried serial numbers. This change had the effect of hardening men in ways both admirable and mournful. They became predictably formidable. Where other legions entangled themselves in debates of honor or policy, the iron hands moved with the certainty of programs executed without delay. Their battle doctrine refined into a mechanized ballet of redundancy. Platoons were constructed so that the elimination of any single node did not collapse the whole. Tanks and dreadnoughts were configured with overlapping systems so that a strike that shattered one servo did not doom the platform. Where Ferrus had taught the salvage of a limb, the council taught the substitution of failure modes. And yet there was vengeance at the heart of much of this. The Grand Calculation was not only a defense against future betrayal, it was an instrument for retribution. The memory of Fulgrim, of the man and of the blade, was seared into many minds as a demonstrative example of what unmeasured desire could become. The council used that memory like a teacher's cane, stern, memory-laden, and salutary. They published lists, names, maneuvers, contingencies, where Fulgrim's decisions were annotated as case studies in hubris. Each revision of the calculation included new directives for identifying ideological contagions, new protocols for vetting poets, rhetoricians, and any outsider with the taste for making slaughter look beautiful. The iron hands became less tolerant of nuance and more intolerant of the conditions that could allow a Fulgrim to arise. It would be a mistake to cast this shift simply as paranoia. The galaxy was not put out of danger by Istvan V, in many ways it was more dangerous. Chaos, like a slow-spreading rust, continued to afflict systems not merely with demons but with seduction. Xenos raiders, hybrid swarms and proxy cults, attacked supply lines, fragments of the traitor legion struck at weak frontier worlds, and dark stars hungered for the weakness of a distracted mind. The Iron Hands responded to these threats with the competence of a machine, and in doing so they found themselves increasingly isolated. Other legions and imperial bodies observed the Iron Hands with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief, because a legion hardened against treachery was less likely to buckle when the galaxy's pressures increased. Apprehension, because the methods of the Iron Hands implied a new standard that others might someday be compelled to match. There were whispers in the salons of the politically inclined that the Iron Hands' embrace of total mechanization was a logistical answer to the ethical question of command, and that such answers seldom stayed localized. Isolation, then, came in both practical and emotional forms. Practical isolation was the easiest to describe. The Iron Hands tightened patrol corridors, preferring secure lines with redundant relays. They accepted fewer foreign envoys and negotiated fewer treaties that required the soft compromises they had made in days prior. Their bases, once open to allied craftsmen who came bearing ornaments and songs, became hermetic. The Council established secure nodes, outposts where even allied legions checked documentation twice. Commerce that carried art and indulgence dwindled. The Iron Hands still repaired alliances when the Empire demanded, but they did so with a protocol-laden face. Their terms were non-negotiable. Emotional isolation was subtler and more aching. The small habits, quick laughs in the mess, shared drinks, a captain's quiet nod to a younger soldier, were not abolished but discouraged. The ritualization of grief made intimacy awkward. If one's sorrow had to be catalogued in a maintenance log, what room remained for spontaneous tenderness? I recall watching a veteran who used to tell bawdy tales by the forge, now halting mid-gesture because a new officer entered the tent. The veteran smoothed his hand over a welded brace as if to check for rust. It was a small, unconscious performance that marked him safe. There were fewer songs. There were more checksums. The Iron Hands' works of vengeance did not limit themselves to doctrine. They went into the field and they punished. Their campaigns over the next decades were surgical, brutal, and, by their own measure, just. Where once Ferris had ordered strikes to secure supply lines or to relieve besieged cities, the Council ordered campaigns designed to root out corruptors and those who trafficked in the languages of seduction. They turned planets into case studies, purges of cults that had metastasized, surgical strikes against demon forges, and long, grinding wars of attrition against Xeno's enclaves that had grown clever and numerous. On one such campaign I was allowed to observe a cleansing operation in the Jade Reaches, a cluster of mining colonies where a chaos cult had taken hold, preaching transcendence by ritual mutilation. The Iron Hands entered with a calm the likes of which I had not seen since Eastvan 5. Their advance was a demonstration of doctrine. Units moved in overlapping arcs, supply columns shadowed by repair corps, and apothecaries steamed through lines ready to treat any casualty. They executed containment, quarantine, and surgical strikes that minimized collateral damage. When they finished, the cult's instruments lay inert, art turned to scrap, and the colonists, if shaken, would survive. For many onlookers the operation was moral and effective. For those who watched closely there was a disquieting precision to it, a way of purging that felt more like pruning than mercy. The difference is a small thing, it is where compassion stops and calculation begins. There were also missions that tested the limits of what was morally acceptable even to hardened veterans. In the Vale sector a group of Iron Hands identified a network of artisans as a front for a Xeno sympathizer ring. The Council had encoded a set of heuristics into their intelligence protocols that, while statistically effective, allowed for false positives when applied with too little human oversight. The artisan enclave was destroyed before the error was corrected. When the Council later audited the operation, they noted procedural failures and revised protocols, but the moral cost was not restored. Such events taught the Iron Hands a grim lesson. Perfection of a system does not equate to perfection of outcomes. They learned to double down, they learned to build more redundancy into decision-making even as they encouraged fewer human interventions. In short, they trusted equipment more and people less. Isolation fed the same creatures of thought that had driven them to mechanize. Where once the Iron Hands might have bargained with other legions for intelligence, now they relied on their own sensors, and their own sensors began to trust only the patterns they themselves recognized. Echo chambers form not only in rhetoric but in instrumentation. I wrote later, with no small concern, about how the Council's feedback loops could ossify into dogma. A particular method yields success in a subset of situations, then managers extrapolate and apply it beyond its scope. In doing so, they guarantee a kind of brittleness that is precisely what the calculation sought to remove. Yet, for all that, the Iron Hands developed a resilience admired in military academies and feared in taverns. Their grand calculation evolved into an art of its own, predictive maintenance that could anticipate battlefield failure weeks before it occurred, recruitment algorithms that matched physiognomy with likely stress responses, and field circuits that rerouted power to damaged limbs within seconds, saving lives that would otherwise have been lost. These were not illusions of power, they were reals. Men survived because of them. Where previously a messenger might be lost to a sniping party and the formation collapse, now the formation rerouted and the messenger was replaced. Small mercies, perhaps, but mercies nonetheless. The Iron Hand's stance against chaos hardened them into useful instruments for the Imperium. They became the preferred legion for tasks that required a low error rate and an unsentimental hand. High Lords sent them where infiltration was likely, planetary governors called them when cults bred in secret. They answered, and their answer was methodical and propulsive. The Imperium repaid them with contracts and territory. It also looked at them with a careful wariness. There were treaties signed and honors bestowed, but always with the silent knowledge that iron men are less comfortable at a banquet table than in a repair bay. And so their existence became lonelier. They allied when necessary, but their partners were invariably those who accepted their terms. These were not always simple alignments of ideology. Sometimes a Xeno's threat required a coalition and the Iron Hands would serve, flanked by alien auxiliaries, among whom they moved like surgeons. In such moments they proved again that the human spirit and the engineered mind could cooperate, yet in their camps they returned to the cold comforts of the calculation and the quiet hum of servos. There are human stories woven into this fabric. I would be remiss to suggest all was calculation and no sentiment. Techmarine Marek, who once argued for preserving Ferris's small kindnesses, became a central figure in reconciling the iron with the human. He modified certain prostheses with negligible inefficiencies that nevertheless allowed for micro-expressions, minute flexions of face or hand that transmitted more warmth than the Council approved. This was not rebellion so much as homage. Marek's tinkering allowed veterans to recover a trace of what had been lost. When his alterations were discovered, the Council frowned and harmonized his designs into sanctioned, expressive modules that neutralized the risk Marek had worried about while retaining the human signal. It was a cautious compromise and one that reminded me that even in a mechanized legion there are pockets of humanity that find ways to endure. There were also darker evolutions. The Council sanctioned programs that monitored ideological sentiment across its ranks. In nets woven through comms and social nodes, indicators of excessive rhetoric, words that suggested an inclination towards heroics for spectacle, were flagged. Individuals showing repeated markers were routed to retraining modules, their privileges limited, and, in extreme cases, they were interned until they learned to value the calculation over the song. The procedures were efficient and, for the Council, necessary. For others, they read as preludes to something more controlling. It is the paradox of protection. To stop a contagion you must sometimes quarantine thought itself. Through the decades the Iron Hands became an instrument of the grand calculation and simultaneously its chief philosopher. They wrote treatises on the ethics of augmentation and on the permissible parameters of sacrifice. I read those treatises and I found in them both cold deduction and sorrowing reverence. The authors, men with scars and serial digits, argued that love and loyalty remained possible under the new system, provided those effective bonds did not degrade mission integrity. The language was careful, almost unwilling to admit that certain human behaviors were, by statistical measure, liabilities. The treatises revealed a community thinking hard about trade-offs, what to keep and what to discard, and doing so in a way that made the decisions feel inevitable even where they were not. The Iron Hands, in their rebirth, thus became a living question posed to the galaxy: can a people remake themselves so as to be invulnerable to corruption without becoming something worse than the corruption they sought to stop? They answered, in practice, with a stern yes, and with caveats that only time could validate or condemn. They became both guardians and exemplars of a doctrine that prized survival and clarity, yet their methods raised a quiet unease among those who remembered Ferris as more than a schematic. As for me, the chronicler, I walked their corridors and catalogued both instruments and intimacies. I listened to the whir of servos like a new hymn. I recorded hearings where the council argued doctrine until the steel of the room seemed to resonate with tension. I wrote about the men who accepted the calculation as salvation and those who whispered of its cost. I kept the small human acts that Marek preserved, and I tucked them into my notes as if they were shards of glass that might one day become a lens. The Iron Hand's future, so the council professed, would be shaped in the language of survival. They would be ordered, efficient, and merciless in the pursuit of anything that threatened the Imperium's structure. They would be fathers of an anti-chaos doctrine and unwilling champions of a philosophy that prized function over feeling. They would know themselves as instruments for a galaxy that demanded many kinds of sacrifices. And yet, when the forges cooled for a moment and the men eased into their cold bunks beneath layered armor, someone, sometimes a sergeant, sometimes a tech priest, sometimes an old veteran, would whisper a story of Ferris. It would be small and unsanctioned. The story might be of a clasped hand in a midnight repair or of a time Ferris forgave a man for a needless mistake. Those stories were rare and quiet and precisely the kind of thing the grand calculation could not measure. In that smallness I found hope and apprehension braided together. The Iron Hands had been reborn, harder and more certain than before, and the future they pursued would be won by metrics and by iron, but the human shadows they once cast also remained, stubborn and unpredictable. In the end, the rebirth was not a conclusion, it was a new design problem. The Iron Hands marched forward, forged into a machine with a human history embedded inside its gears. Whether the future would crown them saviors of an unstable galaxy or condemn them to be a cold, corrective measure is not a question for the short span of a chronicle. It is a question time must test. As for me, I will continue to record, to listen for the hum of servos and the whisper of the past, and to note when the two reconcile or when they rend one another apart. I am Gas Havelock, and I have spent my life learning how to listen to the small noises that survive in the wake of great machines. I set down these last pages not to render judgment but to bear witness, to mark what was lost, what was kept, and what the Iron Hands became after the crucible. Their story is not a clean parable with a single moral. It is a long, jagged argument between what we can engineer and what we cannot excise. Ferris Manus was never a gentle man. He worshipped function with the devotion of a priest and moved among men like a master craftsman among apprentices. He taught a legion to convert failure into salvage, to temper tendon into tendon of steel, to make pain an engineering problem rather than a sentence. That doctrine saved lives and created monsters of habit, men who could be mended, men who rarely asked whether they ought to be. When Fulgrim's betrayal cleaved the world between spectacle and survival, it was Ferris's creed that tried to hold the torn edges together. It held for a time. Then it was tested in a way no blueprint foresaw. When Ferris fell at Eastvan 5, the Iron Hands did not collapse into mourning in the way other peoples might. They catalogued loss, incorporated failure into doctrine, and rebuilt. The grand calculation that followed was not merely a manual of tactics, it was a metamorphosis of identity. Augmentation became compulsory, rituals of maintenance became rites, and grief itself was translated into metrics and procedures. In these choices the Legion found what it sought most fiercely, predictability. They became harder to surprise, less likely to crack when whispers of sedition crept over the next ridge. They became efficient in a way that the restless galaxy both requested and feared. But efficiency is not a cure for sorrow. In private corners, beneath oath-laden forges and behind the closed shutters of apothecaries, the old human things persisted. Tech Marines like Marek found ways to let veterans keep minuscule expressions, a microflex that made a father's face say, "I remember," to a son who had been rebuilt. Small guilds hid carved tokens under floorboards. In the quiet, men still told the stories of Ferris's odd compassion, the way he would adjust a prosthetic not just for torque but for the comfort of a hand held in farewell. These acts were furtive and fragile, but they mattered. They were reminders that beneath the plating of doctrine there remained people who had loved and been loved. The Iron Hand's rebirth carried with it vengeance and prudence in equal measure. They hunted cults and demon forges with a relentlessness born of memory. They cleansed worlds where seduction had found purchase. Their methods were brutal and surgically effective. They closed corridors of influence that had once led to Fulgrim's corruption. Yet the very instruments they used to defend the Imperium, predictive maintenance, sentiment analysis nets, mandatory augmentation, began to redefine what it meant to be one of them. Loyalty became a measurable metric. Dissent could be flagged as a potential failure mode. Isolation followed naturally from such hardening. Allies found them less congenial companions, governors welcomed their discipline but avoided their counsels. The Iron Hands took tasks that required a cold hand and performed them with scant appetite for praise. Their existence became a litmus test for the question Ferris had first posed in a humbler voice: how much should we trade of the human for the durable? They answered, time and again, by giving the machinery precedence. And yet the balance remained unresolved. That is the truest thing history taught me while watching these men. There is no final calculation that fully contains heartbreak, no protocol that can completely substitute for a hand on a shoulder. Mechanical precision can prevent some betrayals, it cannot stop the quiet ache of memory. The Iron Hands learned to live with both truths: they could be exemplary in survival and imperfect in mercy. They pressed on because to do otherwise would be to let the cost at East Van 5 be meaningless. But pressing on did not erase the questions Ferris had once asked in a softer tone: what is the value of a life rebuilt? What is the cost when the ledger becomes the god? If Ferris's name endures, it is more complex than homage. He is remembered as both the architect of salvation and the implicit author of a hardness that cost men something essential. The Iron Council and the Grand Calculation turned his lessons into law, they preserved his temper and, in some ways, betrayed his tenderness. That contradiction is the marrow of their legacy. They are both the instrument he forged and the warning he might have feared. Where I stand as chronicler, I hold both the ledger and the small keepsakes Marek hides in his lab. I record the iron hymns and the faint, outlawed lullabies. I write down the precision of their clinics and the names of those who quietly read Ferris's old notes to their children. The future of the Iron Hands will be judged by the age that follows them, whether they become a bulwark that shields the galaxy from chaos, or whether their mechanized remedy calcifies into a sterility that consumes the very camaraderie that allowed them to endure. For now they remain what they chose to be, a people of steel and memory, ever vigilant, ever calculating, carrying within their plates the ghost of a man who loved both craft and companionship. Balance remains unsettled, but their will is indomitable. They press forward not because they have answers but because they must act upon the ones they have. In that motion there is both nobility and sorrow, and, for those of us who remember the sound of a human laugh in a forge, a quiet, painful hope that somewhere between the gear and the heart they will find a way to keep both alive.